Imagine you're in your own home, in your own business, and someone, without knowing who you are, simply disrespects you. The shame that causes. The anger. Now, what if I told you that this person who humiliated you could have been your most important client? That happened. And it wasn't a simple mix-up. It was a mistake that changed lives. And the reaction of the woman, the owner of a bank, was something no one could have predicted. She walked into the branch with no idea that the treatment she would receive would change her perception of humanity. It was an ordinary day, until she came across something unexpected. Something that could have destroyed her confidence. But instead, she did something that few would have the courage to do. That morning seemed like just another. The sky was clear, the warmth of the sun seeped through the bank's windows, and people moved around, immersed in their routines. Nothing seemed out of place until she walked through the door. She owned the bank. But that wasn't all. She owned a network of banks which, over the years, had established itself as one of the most reliable in the region. She was no longer a customer. She didn't need to prove anything to anyone, not that attendant or the manager. However, the story of how her identity was ignored would begin there, in that bank that she herself helped to manage. She arrived with a large check, a significant deposit, a reflection of her hard work, her vision, her success. And, like any high-end customer, she went up to the counter to make the deposit. The clerk, young and inexperienced, was behind the till. She looked at her quickly, without much interest, and, without doing any kind of basic check, began to process the deposit. But her surprise soon became clear. She began to hesitate, her fingers trembling slightly, as if she had seen something she didn't understand. The woman knew that check was legitimate. It was one of her own clients, someone she had dealt with personally. What happened next was something that many women, especially black women, are familiar with. The clerk, without even asking for more information or confirming the origin of the check, looked at the woman in front of her with a confused look. Suddenly, she seemed to have forgotten all the protocols she had learned. The kind of look she received was not that of a professional trying to make sure everything was all right. It was a suspicious look, reflecting a deep doubt about the legitimacy of that woman and the value of her presence in that institution. As if the woman in front of her, even with a clear check, had no right to be there. As if that check was somehow suspicious just because of who was depositing it. The manager, who was at the back of the room, noticed the strange interaction. He approached the attendant, not to help, but to take charge. As if he knew in advance that the situation needed to be controlled. He arrived with the smile of someone who knew exactly what he was doing. But little did he know that he was about to make an irreparable mistake. Looking at the check and without asking for details or consulting the source, he said, with an almost arrogant tone, "This check is too big to be accepted here. You don't have enough accounts to cover it." The manager didn't bother to investigate, didn't make a call to check if the check was legitimate, didn't give any consideration to the woman in front of him. He just assumed with immense confidence that she couldn't possibly be someone important, someone who could deposit a check of such magnitude. She stood there, watching that man who, without hesitation, had judged the validity of the check and, worse, the value of her own person. The contempt, the look of disdain, the impersonal treatment she received was not just a matter of banking protocol. It was something deeper. It was a question of social perception, of veiled racism, where the color of one's skin determined one's value, even if one's assets, social position, and background spoke for themselves. She was a black woman who owned a bank and, at that moment, the manager couldn't look at her beyond her color. To him, the woman in front of him was just a simple customer, someone who probably had no idea how the banking system worked. What the manager didn't know was that she was no ordinary customer. She was the owner of that bank and others. She had invested years of her life, not only building a solid career, but also facing challenges that few could understand. Behind her calm demeanor, there was a story of overcoming, a story of resistance. She knew what it was like to be ignored, what it was like to be undervalued. But she also knew what it meant to earn her place in the sun, working tirelessly to overcome the adversities that her race and gender imposed. She knew that she had the right to be treated with respect, just like any other successful entrepreneur. The irony of the situation was that that morning, when she walked into that bank, she wasn't just making a deposit. She was being challenged by the lack of recognition. It was as if all her success, all her hard work, was unimportant in the face of simple prejudice. She didn't want to attract attention. She didn't want to be seen as someone who had to explain her story or her position. But there she was, being forced to do so. She was being disrespected not only by the manager and the attendant, but by a system that, for all its greatness and success, still didn't know how to recognize the true measure of a person's worth. Instead of giving in to frustration, the woman did something that few people could do at that moment. She remained calm, controlled. But it wasn't just any control. It was a calm charged with purpose, with intention. She knew that this incident could be the turning point not only for the bank, but for many others who had not yet realized the power of mutual respect. She wouldn't be just another woman ignored. She would not let that man, with his ignorance and arrogance, decide who she was or what she stood for. The woman, faced with that arrogant manager, felt a chill run down her spine. It wasn't a normal chill, but the kind of feeling that comes when you realize you're about to cross a line. The line that separates passivity from action, the moment when you swallow your pain and turn to fight. She looked directly into the manager's eyes, who still had a complacent smile on his lips, as if he had just corrected a fault she hadn't even known she had committed. His gaze was dismissive, as if he were dealing with yet another ordinary customer, someone who, because of her appearance, wasn't capable of generating the kind of value he saw as worthy of respect. But she knew who she was. And, more importantly, she knew what that situation represented. It wasn't about that particular check. It wasn't about the value of a simple deposit. It was about the deep disdain she had experienced throughout her life, especially as a black woman in a sector where inequality was more than visible. She had always known that her color, her presence, often became invisible barriers in spaces she had conquered with so much effort. But at that moment, the weight of those barriers became unbearable. She was tired of being ignored, tired of being seen as someone of lesser value. But she wouldn't give in to anger. She wouldn't give in to frustration. That would not be her answer. She moved even closer to the counter, without taking her eyes off him. Her voice, now calm and controlled, cut through the heavy morning air. "Are you telling me that my check isn't worth enough to be accepted? That I don't have enough accounts to cover it?" The woman took a deep breath before continuing, her gaze remaining steady. "You know who I am, don't you?" The manager, clearly baffled by the question, hesitated. He realized that he didn't know. And not only that, he had never imagined that someone with an appearance like hers could be at the top of the pyramid, where he saw himself as part of the established financial system. She wasn't just some woman trying to deposit money. She was one of the founders and owners of that institution, a woman who had invested her life in that bank, who had built that empire from scratch. For a moment, the manager remained silent, the weight of the truth beginning to fall on him. But pride blinds, and he wasn't ready to give in. It was hard for him to swallow the idea that a black woman could be so successful, so influential. He was uncomfortable. He didn't know how to deal with it. What he did next, however, was something that many people would do in situations like this. He tried to deflect the blame, as if the whole thing was a matter of process, as if he was just following the rules. But she knew it was much more than that. He was applying a rule that, in his mind, seemed fair, but which in reality was deeply rooted in prejudices that he didn't even realize in himself. She took a deep breath and, with one smooth movement, took her cell phone out of her purse and started typing. The manager, realizing that she was more focused on what she was doing than on responding to his attempts to belittle her, made a gesture as if he regretted his attitude, but his words still reflected a tone of superiority. "Are you aware that, due to bank policy, This deposit cannot be processed without additional verification? He wanted to divert the conversation, to minimize the discomfort he himself had caused. But he was talking to the wrong person. And she knew it. She knew that the time to act had come. Without even looking at him, the woman finished typing quickly on her cell phone. The sound of the keys being pressed echoed like a reminder of the power she possessed, a power that the manager didn't understand. Within seconds, she had sent an email to her personal assistant and to one of the bank's vice presidents. It was simple, a direct and clear request, without beating around the bush. The message read, "Please come to the branch immediately. The branch manager is having trouble processing a deposit from a customer. The check seems to have been refused for no reason." It was a short message, but it carried a lot of weight. She knew it would cause a stir. And, deep down, she knew that the manager still wouldn't understand what was going on. When the personal assistant replied with a confirmation that she was on her way, she closed the mobile screen and looked again at the manager, who was already beginning to realize that things weren't going so well for him. He began to stutter, trying to backtrack, trying to apologize somehow, but there was no more room for excuses. What he had done was unforgivable. He had judged the woman by the color of her skin and her appearance, without ever even bothering to realize who she really was. She wouldn't be the last person to be treated like that, but it would certainly make him an example so that others would never repeat the same ignorance. The moment was about to intensify. She knew that when the assistant and the vice president arrived, the truth would be exposed. They would understand what was really going on there. She was about to break down the barriers of ignorance that had been imposed on her, and, at that moment, the manager, in his arrogance, would be forced to recognize that the prejudice he carried in his heart could no longer be hidden. But she also knew that this was not just a victory for her. It was a victory for all women, for all black people who were underestimated, who were disregarded, who had to fight against a system that didn't seem to want to see the true value of their existence. She didn't care about immediate recognition. What she wanted was for him to know, right then and there, that the world is not limited to his narrow, prejudiced vision. She was there not to apologize for who she was, but to remind him that no one should ever have to apologize for their own greatness. She held the key to success, and nothing, not even the cockiest manager, could ever take that away from her. The silence in the service room now seemed like an unbearable weight. When the bank's vice president arrived at the branch, closely followed by the woman's personal assistant, the tension in the air increased even more. The vice president's footsteps echoed through the corridors, as if he already knew exactly what was going on. It was no longer just a question of a rejected check. Something much bigger was at stake. The manager was visibly nervous, his face pale and his shoulders hunched, as if he knew he was about to be confronted by something he couldn't ignore or explain. But nothing had prepared him for what was about to happen. The woman, with impressive control over her emotions, looked at the vice president, who was watching her with an expression of surprise, but also respect. She gestured with her hand, inviting him to come closer. "You know the process, don't you?" she asked calmly, her voice now with a firmness that none of her subordinates had seen before. "You know that nothing in this bank should be refused without a proper check. There's nothing in this check to justify what your manager did." The vice president, without hesitation, looked at the manager, who was clearly speechless. The weight of the situation fell on him all at once. The woman had spoken with unquestionable confidence. She wasn't just right, she was determined. And everyone there knew it. "I didn't know that, ma'am," the manager finally stammered, trying to apologize and find an explanation that could save his position. But he already knew that he was running out of time. The vice president, with a dark look on his face, made a discreet movement with his hand, giving a clear signal for the manager to leave. The silence in the room grew. The manager, defeated, left the scene without looking back, aware that his authority had been destroyed at that moment. But the woman didn't feel victorious. She wasn't there to demean anyone. She was there to correct a systemic error that he represented. And in doing so, she knew she was challenging something much bigger than her own story. As soon as the manager left the room, the vice president looked at the woman, now with a new expression on her face. It was a mixture of respect and, perhaps, a touch of admiration. "You know what you're doing, don't you?" he asked, his voice laden with a deep understanding that she wasn't just any customer. She was a force to be reckoned with. The woman, with a discreet smile, replied, "I know what I'm doing, but what worries me is what happens when people like your manager take control and ignore the value of others." He didn't just disregard the check, he disregarded what I represent. Her voice was no longer soft. It was assertive, powerful. "This isn't just my problem. It's part of what I face every day. And I'm sure I'm not the only one." The vice president was silent for a few moments. He knew she was right, but he also knew that the system he represented had its flaws. And those flaws were not easy to fix. The woman continued, "What worries me most is that this was not an isolated incident. I know that in many other places, in many other agencies, people are disregarded in the same way. What we see here is not just a mistake by a manager. It's a reflection of what's ingrained in the system." The vice president looked at her with a mixture of respect and slight unease. He knew she wasn't just talking about a simple protocol error. She was pointing to a systemic issue of prejudice, a direct criticism of the bank's functioning, a criticism that many within the organization were trying to ignore. But it could no longer be ignored. She was touching the deepest wound in a system that, for too long, had been kept silent. The woman, realizing that the conversation was heading in the right direction, looked directly at the vice president and said as clearly as her experience allowed, "I don't want an excuse. I want a change. This can't just be an isolated case that you try to erase. If we really want the bank to be a reflection of a more inclusive and fairer future, we need to start acting now. This can't be an exception. It needs to be the rule." She paused, letting her words hang in the air. The vice president, clearly touched by her seriousness, finally nodded. But he knew the change wouldn't be easy. He knew that the structure of the bank, like any large institution, was deeply rooted in old habits and perceptions that would need to be challenged. And that would start with him. The woman stood up, adjusting her coat with a precise and final gesture, as if the meeting had ended but its impact remained in the air. She was no longer there just to right a wrong. She was there to be the catalyst for something bigger, something that transcended that simple dispute over a check. She was there to show that when you have the courage to stand up against the system, when you have the strength to challenge the inequality that is veiled by so many, real change can begin to happen. And as the vice president stood there in silence, staring at the door where she left, he knew that nothing would ever be the same again. The bank and its culture were about to be confronted in a way he couldn't have foreseen. The woman was not just a customer. She was a symbol of resistance. She was change. And he could no longer ignore her. The woman left the agency with her head held high, but not as the winner of a simple confrontation. She knew that she had only taken the first step on a longer journey, where the battles against prejudice and systemic failures would require more than courage. They would require persistence. The manager, who might never understand the true weight of his actions, would remain in his bubble of privilege, while the woman knew that her fight would not be isolated. She wasn't the only one to suffer this kind of discrimination, and this wouldn't be the last incident of injustice. But she would not remain silent. With one simple act, she not only challenged an individual wrong, but also planted the seed of change that could one day blossom into a fairer system. After the meeting, the vice president reflected on her words. At first, he may have felt he was dealing with a simple complaint, but he knew he was facing something much deeper. The woman wasn't accusing him personally, but pointing out a structural problem that would need a collective approach and a real effort to correct. He knew it wouldn't be easy. Changing such a large and established system would require more than good intentions. It would require action, and immediate action at that. And that's how that woman, with her silent strength, didn't just correct an injustice at the bank. She lit a flame of awareness. The real impact of that day would be felt in the small changes that would begin to happen internally. A commitment to inclusion, respect, and, above all, human dignity. After all, true power does not lie with those who have the last word, but with those who have the courage to challenge norms and forge a new path. Not only did she show how to fight injustice, but she also taught everyone watching the true value of integrity. And that lesson will undoubtedly live on. Just for those who like a good story and have watched to the end, leave your comment below from which city you're watching. And there's one more thing. Wife kicked out after having black triplets. 10 years later, a shocking surprise. That's the theme of the video I've embedded here. Just click and watch. I'll see you there.